Hello, and welcome to DIY Access. I'm your host, Kat Chuddy, and today I'll be having a conversation with Stevie Ada Klaark about being an adjunct in a university system and how that intersects with issues of access in the classroom. Stevie Ada Klaark works interdisciplinarily. Clark relays how we can use certain culture and gestures to walk a line amongst the sublime, the absurd, and the comic to reveal how this can be translated to the viewer through multimodality and phenomenological experience. She holds an MFA from Cornell University College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, and a post-bachelorette from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and Tufts University. Their work has been featured in numerous publications such as the Chicago Review, Bat City Review, and Boom. Clark has also exhibited internationally at many different places, such as Bikini Wax EPS in Ciudad, Mexico, and Milk Glass Co. in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. She has been an artist in residence at places like Vermont Studio Center in Johnston, Vermont, Zen Mountain Monastery in Mount Tremper, New York, and forthcoming at Ragdale Foundation, Lake Forest, Illinois. They are presently an adjunct professor at Minneapolis College. Previously, they have been an adjunct professor at Minneapolis College of Art and Design, an instructor at Cornell University, Cornell Prison Education Program in Ithaca, New York, and an educator at Marwin in Chicago, Illinois. She has been a visiting artist at Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, Maryland. She is a mentor for the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop in St. Paul, Minnesota. They have been a participant in the People's Forum School of Art, Culture, and Resistance and the Revolutionary Summer School in New York, New York. They're an education steward for Fireweed Community Woodshop, Minneapolis, Minnesota. She was born on unceded Apache and Navajo lands in 1988. Clark presently lives and works on unceded Dakota and Anishinaabe lands. Their work is invested in the new future economy of care, and she is writing her first novel. Without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Stevie Ada Klaark. I'm here with Stevie Ada Klaark, and we're going to have a conversation today about adjuncting in the university system and how that butts up against issues of access in the classroom. Stevie, do you want to briefly talk about yourself and maybe some of the artwork that you do and some of your teaching?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kat, for having me on this podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you. And um, I am an interdisciplinary artist, writer, and adjunct professor um, who uh, who works primarily right now with sound and water as a medium. I am currently living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on Anishinaabe lands, and um, I have been uh, teaching for some time. I currently adjunct for Minneapolis College, and I'm very excited to be speaking to the experiences that uh, hopefully are also not only my own, but might resonate with other people.
Okay, let's go ahead and start with how important are adjuncts to the university system? I think a lot of people know that this type of job position exists, but don't fully understand how it really functions within that system.
Oh yeah, good question. Good start. I Adjuncts are really indispensable to the university system. However, they truly are treated as dispensable. A mentor of mine, when I talked with him about an experience I was having, reminded me of that dispensability as a measure of preparedness. And so adjuncts, especially myself, speaking from my experience, are usually very aware of the transitory nature of their work and the instability of their value to a system that I think is always sort of trying to grapple with their existence. And adjunct labor fills gaps where institutions have faltered or where neglect or blind spots have impaired the institution's ability to meet the needs of their student populations. And this adjunct labor is also a clear case in point that reveals the business model of higher education. So these academic institutions, as we know, are businesses that are looking to lower their costs, and oftentimes at all costs, including those who they're bringing in to teach.
Okay. And you already got into some of the disadvantages of being an adjunct. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring light to that maybe isn't getting as much attention um, in terms of those disadvantages?
Oh, yeah. I think I'll begin here with a narrative. I was on a walk early one morning in my neighborhood, and I have a dog. And so we were on one of our daily morning walks, and this woman who I believe was named Anne, if my memory recalls right, was about to pass us. And then she said hello to my dog, and we had a good time engaging. She was probably in her 70s, and I started asking questions about her. She started asking questions about me. Who am I? What do I do? Etc. And I explained to her those things, and she said to me point blank, "Adjuncts get paid shit." And I laughed because it was really refreshing to have this kind of honesty around my work. And I think Anne said it best as anyone has yet when I encounter them and we talk about that work. People will sort of skirt around it, but Anne got straight to it. And sometimes you just have to call something what it is plainly and in a way that gets to the point quickly. And the reality is that these kinds of labors and laborers continue to be so because there are no uniting organizations to standardize or support this population. And I say that with the realization that there are many unions for adjuncts at specific institutions. However, even if they're unionized, having once been a part of a union at an institution as an adjunct, I found them to be more about optics than anything else for the institution. So the institution can say, we're doing this, that, and the next thing for our adjuncts, but really it's pretty performative.
What do you mean by optics? Like just the visibility, like the performative kind of look, we're doing something, or
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah, that's what I mean by optics for sure. Just saying like yeah, the performance of it. Just saying they can say to committees or initiatives or even can if an adjunct tries to negotiate a contract, they can say, well, you're in a union or they can there's not much negotiation for contracts um that occur in my experience for adjuncts. You sort of are being offered what you're offered and you either accept it or again it goes back to that dispensability. You can be replaced, very easily. So I think in part it's an institution's way of both protecting themselves or giving the illusion that they are providing a space of opportunity and growth and community for adjuncts, when in reality it really is truly performative.
you were making me remember the semester that I adjuncted in an ESOL program. Um, they renegotiated my contract after the fact, and I didn't even know that that was a thing that they could do. So they lowered
Oh
my
my gosh.
pay based on how many students were in the classroom. And I think
Mm,
things like that happening, like people are not as I mean, especially talking to some of my peers, they don't know that schools can do things like that.
yes, exactly. And they can. I think that all of these conversations are sort of happening with people who, adjuncts are pretty busy, very busy people usually who have many, in my experience, ways in which they're making their lives and careers work. And so I think that a lot of these experiences sort of get left in our conversational spaces and in our institutions as we're going through our master's programs or educator programs. There isn't a lot of talk about what we're doing within contract negotiation, for instance. At least that never came up in any of my MFA, and I would say it would be safe to say that most of um, my colleagues, there was never any talk about what do you do during these scenarios where someone might do this or that within a contract negotiation. Um, because again, I think many people just don't even approach negotiation because most people understand, again, that dispensability and um, are even just afraid to approach it, which is a whole other sort of topic of discussion around who is and is not um, able to negotiate, you know?
Yeah, like a kind of a hostage situation where you feel like you just have to take what they're giving you, because that's how I felt. I couldn't even imagine that there were like options for negotiation in that situation.
Right. Yeah, you don't. And at that point, I think most people, especially in education, like you understand that it would be sort of a, a difficult thing to even ask when you're sort of just grateful to be having an opportunity
Right.
is the feeling that most, especially in the arts, you know, I think we're of course talking within the framework of um, visual culture and visual arts. And I think that there is this level of scarcity mindset involved where you go in and you're just like, okay, this is what they're offering, and this is what I'll take.
I feel like that's compounded too by what's going on with the economy, with inflation and
Mhm.
housing, and so you've just got kind of a perfect storm of desperation where I'll just take whatever you give me, you know?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
With all that being said, I mean, we could probably spend an hour just talking about all the disadvantages. I was wondering
Mhm.
if, is there, can you imagine that there are any advantages to being an adjunct, or does it afford you any additional freedom in the classroom or outside of it?
Oh, absolutely. I think that as with most everything, there are certainly ways of seeing the advantages of this mode of working or any mode of working. There's certainly incredible flexibility. I also have to say that there is a certain impartiality, which I use that word and I don't want it to be confused with lack of effort. And what I mean by impartiality is that you are afforded by not being associated with just one institution, so you can sort of chameleon your way through each space while maintaining your own sense of identity and selfhood. You get to see the ecosystems of so many places
Mm.
and different spaces, and to me, that's really interesting. I love that I get to connect with so many different people and experiences new spaces all the time. Each program is different and each institution has its own culture, even though there might be a broad sweeping sort of higher ed academia like cloud that they're all in. There's also these nuances to each institution, and you get to see that. And additionally, I believe that many institutions, in my experience, have been willing to work with me in developing one-off courses or workshopping new ideas and syllabus or syllabi objectives. Um, those instances feel really collaborative and empowering. And one institution in particular who has been incredibly supportive of that is Minneapolis College in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And they're a community college. And I appreciate that there is tenacity and warmth there from the people who I've been working with to create different offerings.
I want to jump in here and ask about that specifically. So, uh, what do you what do you find to be, drastically different between the community colleges and the universities? Because I've heard kind of
Mm,
similar sentiments from other adjuncts that they feel more supported in community college environments than universities.
that's a good question. Yeah, I certainly. have had and can add my voice to that experience. I think one, I think it goes back to the students. I think a lot of times the students are just sort of grateful to be there, and I think it has to do with class. Many of the students who are coming in are working from working class backgrounds, and they're just grateful to be able to be there and not be working. As someone who came from a working class background, that was one of my first experiences of being in a classroom, was just like, oh my gosh, I get to think about things and I get to be in thought with other people. And that feels so incredibly outside of any mode in which I'm supposed to operate. And while I might not have been able to give it a language or a name at that time, I was able to understand through action over time that that was a really impactful and important thing because I was being empowered through education. So I think that's like the number one thing is the staff of these institutions are also seeing like that impact on their students and what that means for their families and their communities. There's more of a direct line, I think, to how that education impacts not just one person. So you have a staff who are really dedicated. What that means is also that their funding is often limited. They're usually doing a lot on a smaller budget than universities and colleges, like college systems and universities that are not community based, community college.
Yeah, I think that tracks. I'm thinking about for myself, like looking at peers I've had in the different schools I've been in at the university level. I would always see lots of students that kind of just were going to college, especially at undergrad level, just because it was the thing they were expected to do, and there wasn't really a lot of self motivation or purpose that you saw from a lot of the students.
Yeah, I I think it's interesting because uh, I now have taught in several different programs, and they've been very drastically different from one another, even though they're all housed under that, again, that umbrella term or that cloud of higher education. And I do find that when I teach at private institutions, there is a different demeanor and set of expectations from the students. I do find that I have to uh, kind of implement more space for moments of reflection and gratitude for students, quite honestly. Um, and I think that is not to say that they are ungrateful or that there is, I think there's just a limit when you become resourced to seeing outside of how that resource really extends so far back, and to there's a level of not understanding what it means to go into a space where you already know the language. So if you are a first generation college student or first generation academic, I'll extend it even outward because you're first generation all the way through. um, it is you are learning languages, performances, customs, and so on that you haven't been immersed in, and none of your family, has either. And I think that Bell Hook's teaching to transgress does a really good job of getting to the core of that. And I wish that it was required reading at any institution, really, for everyone, for staff, student, uh, professor, so on.
I you were talking a little bit about money and funding and like how resources help students. That kind of connects with. I wanted to ask about how much do you see as an adjunct in terms of like being burdened by administrative duties and doing things like budget, or are you kind of disconnected from that a little bit? Um, and do you see that as a positive or a negative?
Ugh. That's a very good question. And I don't as an adjunct in particular, you don't have that insight into the administrative duties as much beyond your extension into the classroom with your students. So you have your administrative work that you do and communications with your students and with, usually in my experience, the director of the program or the person who you are um, speaking with in that capacity. And I think there are drawbacks and, of course, positives to that. If you are in multiple institutions, it's definitely a positive because it would just be an insurmountable amount of work if you were required to be a part of the administrative life in that capacity of any institution. Um, the drawback, of course, is that you are also not privy to that information. So you're being affected by all of that, but there is sort of a mystery added in there because you don't know the specifics. So I think there's that capacity. So I think in that way, it's sort of in a gray area. It's both positive and negative. Um, when you're really busy, it's definitely a positive because it affords you more time um, to focus on your students um, and be sort of unburdened by uh, that that administrative work.
Do you feel like not being a part of that affects, how you address access needs in the classroom at all? Or uh, does that make asking for help with support more difficult?
Ooh, that's a good question. I do think that it goes back. I think it goes back to how other faculty might see you in that capacity if you're asking for things that they already know maybe they can't ask for or they can't do because they understand the limitations that are present. If you're going in and you're sort of asking for certain things that an institution has already talked about or a department has already talked about, um, it makes you seem like you're out of the loop, which you would make the assumption that those faculty would understand that you're an adjunct, you're new. However, there isn't often a lot of grace around that, So in part, you come across looking maybe naive or even could risk seeming like you're out of the loop, which inherently you're going to be because you don't have that information. You're not in access, and every institution is so different. Even if again there's this sameness that does or similarities that do unite these programs.
Thank you for that. That was mind-blowing, honestly. It sounds like what you're saying is really obvious, but you just shed light on some situations that I've been in that I never fully understood until right now.
Well, I'm glad that it was helpful. I think that it took me some uncomfortable moments to understand from the other perspective, or the perspective of those folks in which, maybe I was asking questions why I was maybe getting the responses that I had been. And I'm glad that it was helpful because in the moment, it's uncomfortable.
Oh,
And it's not to say that I think that, learning and being in the world will have moments of discomfort. Um, However, I think if we begin to talk about those moments more, hopefully what just happened between us is like the ideal is like that sharing might lead to maybe there's a document or a folder that the adjunct can just be able to have access to where they can just look through it and see what kinds of issues have been on topic. for that department that they're going into, or to have some backstory on, essentially just give them a little grounding before they go in to the program that they're teaching in. Not that they have to be a part of any of the meetings or um, the boards or anything like that, but that they can understand what the sort of pulse is as they go in. I don't know.
No, that's yeah, that was really insightful. I hope that was insightful for other people because that really just my mind just okay, so let's jump into like talking about the access more directly. What are some of the things that you think about when you're considering the access needs of your students in the classroom?
um, since since visual culture and design are at the center of my work and my pedagogical practice, I often think about the visual first. So, what are students seeing? How are they seeing? What are they seeing? So on. And moving beyond this, I think about what they're hearing. For instance, I was adjuncting for an institution during the pandemic where the sound system I was supposed to use never worked, despite my request to the program director, the tech help, and my attempts at getting it programmed. It was an entire semester of struggling with it all, and by the end it showed on me because I'm a human being and I had human moments. And uh, of course the students don't see that the back end efforts and communication that I was involved in. They just see a professor who is struggling with equipment awkwardly in front of a classroom, and it's okay to struggle in a classroom. However, many classrooms, how they're built and constructed and set up, are just not considering what students are hearing,
Yeah.
especially during times where masks are involved and hybrid learning is prevalent and will be a part of our lives in some form for the foreseeable future, as we still are existing within a pandemic. The unfortunate part is that when students review educators at the end of the semester, they don't take into consideration that perhaps the professor really is or was trying to navigate a new state, new bureaucracies, new politics, and they weren't provided the tools they needed to be able to adequately show up for their students. On none of these, I think it's added in maybe in reviews, like, was the classroom efficient maybe, or I've seen some sort of wording. However, I think that the reviews are not really tied to how that affects the performance of a professor or an educator, and then in turn what they're able to provide for their students. Um, yeah, so those are some access needs that have been more recent that I'm thinking about.
You're making me think of, some of the spaces that I've taught in, and the other school I was at had just a terrible air system that I
Mm.
had to practically yell over when it was on, and then when it would kick off, there would be this just deafening silence in the classroom. Um, and it was frustrating for everybody. It was frustrating for everyone who used that room, for the students because they could barely hear, especially if they were at the back of the class. And it was surprising to me because it was a brand new building that they had built. And to see how little consideration went into the actual functionality of the space was a little shocking.
It, yeah, there are moments like that where, yeah, you can be in an institution where they've said, oh, we had a remodel, or we had this, you know, this experience in which we have a new building, and or they'll talk about all these things, and then those details sort of are the ones where you realize how many times there's probably a disconnect from the designers and the people who are making those decisions and the people who are actually using. So it's like this, form over function, perhaps, situation where they're choosing the design of something, the look of something, or even the price of something over the functionality. Like, do we really need a space that is this if it doesn't provide this very basic thing where your instructor is not having to need a megaphone in the classroom, essentially, you know?
Also to jump back, I feel like the last bit we talked about in the question before kind of talk about this like main character syndrome that everybody has. I mean, I do it all the time.
Mm.
I'm sure you do too, where
Mhm.
it's very difficult to, pause and take the moment and put yourself on the other side of the interaction that you're having and imagine not just your needs, but maybe the struggles the other person is having.
Mhm. Mhm. It is. It is. I think it's a part of the human communication that can be difficult because in these moments, I think we're so accustomed to reacting. We live in a culture of reaction. And I think what I'm learning to do more and more is respond. Like, how am I responding over reacting? And how am I making that central to the ways in which I'm taking in information and uh, providing information? Because that's essentially how we're communicating.
Um, In terms of, thinking about things like this in your students, how much do you use institutional support versus, things like encouraging community care, to get what you need?
I really love this question. I think because of how specific each institution and community that this question can get to, in the sense that it's to answer this question, you have to be very mindful of where you are. And institutions will claim to offer support that have the ability oftentimes to lead students to more frustration and even harm. And this likelihood of disappointment and harm increases depending on the experiences and body of the student. So, community care in the past, for me, has been simply suggesting that a student seek assistance from outside nonprofits or community spaces if asked for. So, it's something that I often am careful with. And if appropriate. So there might be a moment where I see an opportunity where I might be able to sort of drop a suggestion. And I also think that student led organizations are also spaces that are quite um, adept at serving academic populations well. And I think there's a voice in numbers. And it's something maybe you found this too, Kat, but from professor to student, there's always going to be a power dynamic that is difficult to move through. Even if you as an individual have made your students aware that you are aware of it, that you build mechanisms in your classroom to sort of break down that power dynamic as much as you can, you're still in the bigger system of the institution, which upholds that. And the bigger system of our society, which is constructed, so there's all these the systems that we sort of are up against when we're trying to examine these structures of power. So I think that as we see maybe the narrative around who professors are, and I think in particular the narrative really changed in some ways during the pandemic and has changed during the pandemic as we've revealed a lot about our own humanness. So I think, on the other end of it, it's also an issue of receptivity. So when I'm offering or encouraging community care, I always ask myself, is the student receptive to that offering? And even if perhaps they aren't, um, and it seems like I don't know how to say this. In the moment, maybe they are not going to find that useful. They can maybe access it in the future, because there are moments where students are like, I can't tend to that now, but I'd like to in the future. So maybe it's like a future community care access or future support. How do I just plant the seed essentially and allow that student to tend to it later? And so that's sort of my method is the idea of simply planting a seed and making that offering for students. Because I think as educators, many of us are can be very caring individuals who are responding to a lot of people's lives. As an educator, you are in the classroom and you have your community of students who you're accessing, but you are accessing each student individually. And that can be incredibly taxing to be meeting every person on a very intimate level. And I think I heard someone say once, like, educators aren't social workers. And um, I think in the pandemic that became even more apparent with what was sort of being asked of educators on all levels. So not just higher ed, but beyond. I think of a friend who I know who's a first grade teacher, and even to now, like the amount of labor that is asked of her and her role. So I personally have had to become more boundaried about what kinds of ways in which I'm leading students to access in community care, which I think is also an important thing for educators to remember, because again, it's a very I think that education is such an important space in which professors hold a lot of opportunity to influence and grow with an individual, and they also don't have to take on that growth for the individual, if that makes sense. And I think that educators sometimes can get wrapped up in taking on the growth of another individual.
That's something I keep being reminded about, is like remembering to disconnect from the people in the classroom. You want them to succeed, but you can't let their failures destroy you. Or, I mean, most of the time it's not even a reflection on you, but you take things so personally when you're teaching. I don't know.
You can, and I think what I think about is, or what I've had to think about more and more is their growth and their growth opportunities are about their path and about them on their way to wherever they're going. And it's their own. It's not mine. And in turn, like if I took that on, I would be robbing them of an opportunity. And so that's the way that I consider it, is like it's not my opportunity, it's there.
It's really refreshing.
Yeah.
Um, do you feel like you when you're bringing up these things and you're trying to get help for your students, or you're trying to figure out, how to route them out, do you feel like adjuncts are less supported in these kinds of things, than, say, tenured professors or associate professors?
This is a great question. And when I read through these questions initially, I really enjoyed this one because of the nature of non-tetheredness within the adjunct role. There have been moments where I have seen a lack of actual support being offered, and and have received a lot of meetings, conversations, and talk over little action. And I can count back to how many moments where I've been in meetings and brought things up and people have sort of just been like, oh, yep, that's the adjunct talking. And sort of privied the conversation of people who have more experience and tenure, um, which is in part, again, it goes back to the hierarchies that are part of the system. However, there is not conversations really going on within academia about how you support the adjunct in being a part of those conversations. Like, I think that would be really wonderful. And I'm hoping as we move forward that there's more and more people who advocate for more listening, for wiser speech, and for caring direct action in these institutions and academic spaces.
I think you've mentioned a couple times, like this idea of being the power dynamic and then being mindful. I had a moment when I was teaching where I'd never phrased something in this way before, but it just kind of slipped out. And I was giving a student feedback, and I said, "Well, you should do this." And the minute I heard it, I went, "Oh, that's a little bit too commanding." And I started immediately seeing like how that could be interpreted as, maybe the student would have some other idea about how to do their work, but because I said it like that, they would um, maybe change what they were doing in their project, and immediately rephrased it. But I think that there's not a lot of self-examination that goes on just on a mass scale of, thinking about what you say and do and how you're affecting these students in the classroom with what you're saying. I don't know if you find that to be true in your experience.
I certainly find that to be accurate. I think that in moments where I've caught myself, I I try to I've been practicing forming those direct statements into questions. So, for instance, I think I've been also asking permission more. Like, are you open to hearing this? Which was not afforded to me during a lot of my undergraduate and graduate endeavors. However, I think there are moments where I recognize that I've inherited a language and a the performance that I'm not even um, aware of. That I had to unlearn. I've had to unlearn those moments where I'm like, I actually would prefer to just ask them if they're receptive to it right now. If they're not, and they would rather talk about something else, a student in a moment. I'd really like to do that. Within the constraints of their work. Not to say that I think there are moments where, and maybe you've found this too, where a student is avoiding something because they're perhaps trying to get around something that actually is very important. And I think that is our role as an educator, is to sort of keep nudging in a gentle and considered way towards that thing. If you see that, that's part of the role of the educator. I think that's why, in my opinion, that's why students go to school, is because they want to be taught and they want a community space where they can grow. But it's a delicate space to make those decisions, and that also comes with the territory in that you're going to make mistakes as an educator.
Yeah.
You're going to make mistakes along the way to getting to that gracefulness of knowing when to pull back and when to sort of push, and when to, make something into a question. There are moments where a declarative statement works too, where you can just say a thing and that lands. But, not everything has to be a question. But I think in what you were speaking to, it's like, I think that there are moments where I've learned that just creating a question and a space for questioning and inquiry has been really effective for me. All that to say that absolutely, and yes, I've had similar experience.
I feel like from a lot of your answers, like just the way that you navigate the classroom is very thoughtful. And I wanted to ask about, do you think that adjuncts have to be more careful, or maybe feel like they have to tread more lightly, or that they have to take more care in how they're teaching because of that lack of job security?
Hmm. Yeah, I do. I do actually think that. I think just I use that word untethered, the untetheredness of the position, it necessitates that delicateness, I think, which to some degree can be good because I think that you are having to be very mindful and aware um, in a way that maybe other academics and professors are not. This said, it's all under sort of uh, this big understanding that your livelihood is at stake every time. And so it makes those moments that maybe would be less big feel even bigger because you're like, oh my gosh, is this really, you can make mountains of molehills, I think, really quickly. However, I also want to extend that we do live in the age of cancel culture. And I think, especially knowing how many professors and people at institutions will have very human moments. Uh, not all, some cancel culture has in academia has been sort of necessary to highlight moments of extreme depravity and also um, harm that's been caused. However, there are moments where we've, at least in my conversations with other academics, where we've seen the tools that are a part of cancel culture used to um, sort of manipulate and even create more friction between students and professors. And I actually don't necessarily condone cancel culture, nor do I think it's very effective in building a culture that is hinged on healthy communication. So I think you move away further and further from healthy communication. Um, yeah.
I'm glad you brought up cancel culture. To me, it seems like another form of conflict avoidance, and just this like unwillingness to be momentarily uncomfortable to sit down and just talk about, whatever happened and deal with it.
Mm-hmm. It's true, there is that, but there's also like the other end of it where there are certain things that institutions just are not set up for to talk about. And that's a bigger issue to me, is like, why are you not creating these spaces where when people are coming together inevitably, and I wish we lived in a world where didn't happen, there will be some sort of harm that is created because there's a lot of moments in which we are not attuned to each other clearly because of all of the bigger issues that we have in the world. And so in these academic institutions, my hope is that more and more as we have conversations around what harm is, what it looks like, what discomfort is, what the differences are, we begin to understand that not every discomfort we have is harmful, that not everything that is harmful is trauma, and that trauma in and of itself is something that most human beings will experience in their lifetime. It just depends on what body, who you are, how you're experiencing the world, what kind of trauma you will have. And sort of normalizing these discussions around things that I think we have been informed about to be inherently shameful of. Like, these are not shameful things, they're a part of the human experience. Again, unfortunately, but also they're a part of us.
Yeah, I think we have to be realistic and just say I'm a human being. I have trauma and baggage. Every single one of us does.
Right, but yeah, but it's like, again, as an academic, I found you can't enter a classroom and say that because students are expecting the professor that's been modeled to them through the media, through academic systems, through years and years of watching, movies and TVs about who a professor is. I'll use this as an example. I had taken a lift one day to get to the graduate seminar I was teaching, and I got into communication and was having conversation with the Lyft driver, and then when I got into the car, he said, "So where are you going?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to teach a class." And I think he misunderstood that I was not a student, essentially. And as we were speaking, he started to clearly understand that I wasn't the student, but that I was teaching the class. And he looked in the rearview mirror and he was like, "You can't be a professor." And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Well, because you're not an old white man." And I was like, "Thank you for saying that. This is perfect." Like, another moment that's very human again. And I laugh because it's like, thank you for saying it so plainly. Yeah, like that is the image, and like those are the ideals that we are still held to, even if some of my most very smart, understanding students are speaking to decolonization, speaking against the patriarchy, doing all these things. Like, they still internally feel most comfortable with that vision of who a professor is.
Yeah.
And anything outside of that challenges their ideals, and then they become uncomfortable, So I would love to be able to walk into a classroom and be able to say, "Hey, I'm a human with all this baggage, and so are you." However, I would immediately, because of the body I'm in, would be perceived as weak,
Yeah.
by students. And I don't know if you feel any sort of sameness around that, but that's the way I would feel walking into a classroom and sort of being on that level of vulnerability.
I don't think I could do that. It's just kind of a dream of mine that we could just
Right.
see each other for, what we really are. I think that there's a little bit of that that's weird because I'm still finishing my MFA, so the teaching I'm doing is in this weird liminal space where um I have one foot in both worlds, and so I'm constantly having these experiences that are very typical of teaching, and I can talk to another teacher and they're like, "Oh yeah, that happened to me." But also I'm having experiences as a graduate student, so it's wonderful, but it's also very strange to exist in that space. I'm trying to hold on to it as long as I can, because I feel like as you get older you forget some of those experiences that could maybe inform your teaching and make you a more empathetic teacher, because you don't want to remember everything that was bad about, your experience at school.
Exactly, because there's so much positive that happened too. I mean, just the experience for me, again, of just being in these institutions was and still is a positive for me. I am always grateful that I enter into these spaces because um, a lot of that hasn't been afforded uh, to past generations for
Yeah.
my family, and so And and having been in environments where I have friends who are always like, I wish I could go to school, I wish I could get an education, and that is still very real, so so yeah, I think that just that is the positive, is that I get to be in these spaces. But moving beyond that is like, once I get into the nuances of everything, I think it's a good thing to be able to go back to it, I think. And it's really nice to have this reminder right now, actually, that I can have all these qualms that are very real and rooted as we're speaking to them. However, there is that inherent reason why. That's the motivator. Like, the positive is the motivator.
Yes. Well, this has been fantastic. I'm going to end with our last question here, which is especially for people who are listening who are not adjuncts and maybe in some positions where they could make some changes. What kind of needs do the adjuncts themselves have in terms of access that maybe these institutions could do a better job of trying to meet?
Being resourced is an access need. By this, the root is distinctly monetary. I'm just going to say it that way. And this is most urgent. Adjuncts need adequate and reasonable pay for their labor, which at the end of the day extends beyond the contact hours. And it takes keeping our minds and bodies cared for in order to be present and show up for this very important work. And adjuncts cannot do this work without health care, food, bills paid, and time to recuperate. So if adjunct labor is to be used well into the foreseeable future, which I suppose it will be, there deserves to be more attention, initiatives, and resources allocated to their development. And so institutions use adjuncts now rather than using, so they're using them rather than seeing their labors as an investment. And adjuncts are simply future full-time professors, and why not treat them as if they have a future? So my question is, if institutions would like to provide the best education possible for their students, as many are claiming to offer, why would they not consider that an investment in the people who have the most contact with the student population should be supporting healthy and thriving? So it's this baseline concern of what access is for adjuncts at this point. The being resourced.
I think that's a great way to end this. And you worded all of that beautifully. Thank you, Stevie, for being on the podcast, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Kat. I'm really grateful and honored that you would speak to me, and I love this podcast and all of the work that you're putting into this experience and the people who you're connecting. And I look forward to continuing our conversations that we've been having since we met in Baltimore.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again to Stevie Ada Klaark for being on the podcast today and being willing to have this really expansive conversation about adjuncting and access within institutional educational systems. I hope you all enjoyed the content, and I look forward to you all joining us again next time. I'm going to be going on a little bit of a break. I'm headed out to Penland for a 2-week workshop on a scholarship, and then I will be having some much needed surgery. So look for another episode somewhere around the end of the summer. Once again, thank you for listening, and tune in next time to hear about our next exciting issue.